Chapter 2 Studies and Dreams. In the summer of 1789, Camp, who had been for some years canon and councillor in Brunswick, determined to make a trip to Paris to be present at the funeral of French despotism, and it was deemed advisable for William to accompany him. They arrived in Paris on the 3rd of August, not being fortunate enough while there to follow tyranny to its grave. Camp revenged his disappointment by doing what most authors would have done in his place. He wrote patriotic letters in favor of the revolution and attracted much attention. Alexander remained behind, probably at Göttingen, pursuing his favorite studies and constantly corresponding with Forster, who was then at Mason's, where he was counselor and librarian of the university. The plan of the great transatlantic journey, formed a year or two before, was laid aside for a time, in order that he might study what was then a new science, geology. He was deep in the writings of the then celebrated geologist Abraham Gottlob Werner. In his peculiar department of science, Werner was undoubtedly the most remarkable man of his time. The son of a poor iron worker, he commenced his career as a mineralogist in the Mineralogical Academy of Freiburg before he was out of his teens. From thence he went to Leipzig, where he was busied himself in defining the external character of minerals, experimenting and eventually in 1774 publishing a work on the subject. Up to that time, the descriptive language of mineralogists had been too indefinite to convey accurate information, or to enable those of different countries to understand each other. However, after publishing this work, which was long a manual, Werner returned to the Mineralogical Academy at Freiburg and took charge of its noble cabinet of natural history. He lectured on mineralogy and the art of mining, rendering the latter intelligible to all by his simplification of the machinery and his drawings and figures. His cabinet of minerals was unrivaled for its completeness and arrangement, numbering 100,000 specimens. He wrote largely in the scientific reviews of that day, the reading of which probably drew the attention of Humboldt towards him. He contributed more to extend the practical knowledge of mineralogy than anyone who had preceded him. Although his method of classifying minerals according to their external characteristics instead of their internal essences, if we may use the phrase, was rather empirical than scientific, his geology too was shallow. His observations were made on the limited portion of the Earth's surface in his own vicinity, and the succession of rock formations which he had found there extended, he reasoned, over the whole surface of the globe. A wider range of observations would have shown him that at a little distance from Freiburg, many of his supposed universal rock formations were not to be found, and that other rocks supplied their place. But as he was obstinate in his theory, he remained ignorant of this fact. He contended for the aqueous formation of almost every kind of rock, the Neptunic theory, as it was called, maintaining that even pumice stone was the production of water. He could not visit, however, the volcanic districts of Italy and the ancient volcanoes of France, fearing perhaps that he might be led to abandon his first theory, a common fault of scientific men. Still, considering the time in which he lived and the little that was then known of the true formation of the earth, Werner was entitled to much credit and is still honorably mentioned as a pioneer in science. He raised the art of mining into the science of geology. Such was Abraham Gottlob Werner, over whose multifarious writings Alexander was now poring. That they made a deep impression on him may be gathered from the fact that we find him in company with his friend Forster in the spring of 1790, making a mineralogical journey. Their route was to the Rhine, though through Holland and to England. While in England, Forster introduced him to Sir Joseph Banks, the famous president of the Royal Society. Humboldt studied the rock formations of the country through which he had passed, especially the basaltic rocks of the Rhine, and embodied the result in a small work which was published in that year. It was entitled Mineralogical Observations on Some Basaltic Formations of the Rhine, and was intended to support the Neptunic theory of Werner. Forster collected materials for his magnus opus, quote, The Views of the Lower Rhine, unquote. In the meantime, William, who had returned from Paris, vibrated through Erfurt, where he and the beautiful daughter of the President, von Dacherdon, to whom he was betrothed, were perfecting themselves in the art of love. And Weimar, the residence of Schiller, with whom he was intimate. Alexander sympathized with his brothers in the character which he was then playing in the delightful drama of life, but he showed no inclination to appear in the same role himself. It was not that he loved women and society less, but that he loved solitude and wisdom more. Besides, had he not his great transatlantic journey to make? To do this properly, it was necessary that he should have done a more thoroughly worldly training. So while William, who was appointed counselor of legation and assessor to the court of Berlin, went thither to familiarize himself with his duties, after which he intended to marry, Alexander, choosing the Department of Finance, set off for Hamburg, and entering the Commercial Academy of Busch and Ebling, studied the practical part of bookkeeping. Ere long he was initiated into its mysteries, but beyond the sense of satisfaction with the performance of a duty always gives, we suspect that he found no delight in them. Evidently he preferred the leaves of flowers, luminous with the handwriting of nature, to the leaves of his day books and ledgers, with their long rows of black figures and their monotonous horizons of red lines. And instead of worshipping gold and silver, as a true bookkeeper would have done, he had a scientific weakness for the less precious metals. He still pursued his mineralogical and botanical studies. Indeed, he was so fond of the latter that he would often take a tramp in midwinter to gather the moss which would only grow at that time. His stay in Hamburg was short, for in addition to his admiration for Werner and his growing taste for mining, one of his acquaintances, Leopold von Buch of Berlin, had just gone to Freiburg to study mining under Werner, who had just published a new theory of the formation of metallic veins. This determined Alexander to vacate his high stool at the mercantile desk and to set off to Freiburg. Before going, however, he had hastened to Berlin to enjoy for a time the society of his mother, who doubtless found his old castle of Tegel too melancholy a place to live in since the death of her husband and the absence of her sons. William was there with his beloved Caroline and his old tutor and friend Kunth, for Kunth was one of the family, if hiring his devotion to their aspects could make him so. After his trip to Berlin, Alexander proceeded to Freiburg, where he remained a year, employing himself during that time in attending the lectures of Werner, in looking for his magnificent collection, and in visiting the mines in the neighborhood. Freiburg had a fine cathedral and several remarkable moments and works of art, but nothing that would have led Humboldt thither except its mines. There were over 100 of these in the country about: silver mines, copper mines, lead mines, and mines of cobalt. How the enthusiastic young mineralogist would have reveled in them. In the spring of 1792, he was appointed assessor to the mining and smelting departments of Berlin. In the latter part of the year, he was removed to Bayreuth as superintendent of mines. In the newly acquired Franconian districts, and officially commissioned to remodel the mining operations there, he was general director of the mines in the principalities of Bayreuth and Ansbach. His duties were many and arduous, for in addition to his scientific labors, he superintended the erection of public institutions in these districts. Bayreuth is divided into two parts, Oberland and Unterland, the former which came more immediately under his supervision in a hilly region intersected by branches of the great Fichtelberg, and rich in the mines of iron and other minerals. Humboldt spent a considerable part of his time in journeying under the country, visiting the various mines and directing the operations of the miners. He descended into the mines for the purpose of making observations on the fungi that grew in the shafts, or pursuing his journeys. He botanized, by the way. If the region was mountainous, he studied the rock formations and speculated on the Neptunic theory of his teacher. Werner, busy as he must have been at this time, he wrote largely for the scientific journals and periodicals, contributing to them the results of his experiments on the physical and chemical laws of metallurgy, and on the susceptibility of plants, their modes of nourishment, color, etc. He also published a work of local botany, a, quote, flora of cryptogamic plants in the neighborhood of Freiburg, unquote, and decided to end it and dedicated it to his former teacher, Wildenau. In 1794, he accompanied the provincial minister von Hardenberg on a political mission to the Rhine. He also made several tours through the Alps districts and Silesia, and an official trip into the province of Prussia and Poland. Not being able yet to begin his great journey, he contented himself with these small ones, slight studies as it were for the great picture that was to be. In 1795, he resigned his station as the director of mines and went to Vienna, where he renewed his passion for botany, studying to great advantage an excellent collection of exotic plants which he found there, and enjoying the society of the geologist Frieselben. He also studied galvanism and made a variety of interesting experiments. He planned an excursion into Switzerland with the Frieselberg, but postponed it to make an Italian journey. The war, which was then raging, confined him to Upper Italy, so that he was obliged to return without visiting the volcanic regions of Naples and Sicily. Shortly before leaving Bayreuth, he had received a letter from his brother William, who, having finished his role as a lover, had now assumed that of a husband, telling him that the health of their mother was failing. She is ill at Tegel, the letter ran. It was dated in June 1795. We, William and Caroline, will remain with her until the spring. On his return from Italy, another letter reached him, one of those mournful letters which every man sooner or later receives. It bore the escutcheon of death, a black seal. There was a new grave at Tegel. His mother was dead. In the beginning of the year 1797, he went to Jena, where his brother William was then residing, where he found Freshelben and Goethe. Goethe was so much interested in his studies in anatomy that he devoted the rest of his stay in Jena to that science. On his return to Weimar, he wrote to Schiller, "I have spent the time with Humboldt agreeably and usefully. My natural history studies have been aroused from their winter sleep by his presence." And Schiller wrote back shortly after, "Although the whole family of Humboldt, down to the servants, lie ill with ague, they still speak of only of great journeys. But sick or well, Humboldt's studies went on. He continued his experiments on galvanism, turning his attention chiefly to the laws of muscular irritation and the disposition of the nerves of living animals when under the galvanic influence. He wrote a work on this subject, Experiments on Nervous and Muscular Irritation, and sent to his old teacher, Blumenbach, who published it for him with notes and comments of his own. The brothers went to Berlin in May to settle the family inheritance. Previous to making a journey together into Italy, William's share was the old castle at Tegel, Alexander's the estate at Ringenwald in Neumark. He sold it to the poet Franz von Kleist to raise the necessary funds for his great journey. The unsettled state of affairs in Italy preventing the contemplated journey, William and his family determined to proceed to Paris. Alexander went with them as far as Salzburg, which he was induced to stay in a while by his friend Leopold von Buch. Buch, who had just published that scientific work, Outlines of a Mineralogical Description of Landerdeck, had been, as the reader remembers, one of his fellow students in the Meteorological Academy at Freiburg, and was like him a believer in the Neptunic theory of Werner. Humboldt afterwards called him the greatest geologist of the age. A scientific trip was proposed, and the pair started off on foot, armed with their geological hammers and a change of linen. They traveled through several cantons of Salzburg and Styria, and reached the Tyrolese Alps. While on this bohemian trip, Humboldt made the acquaintance of Lord Bristol, an English nobleman, who had visited the coasts of Greece and Illyria, and had planned an expedition to Upper Egypt. The party were to be provided with astronomical instruments and be able draughtsmen, and were able to ascend the Nile as far as Assouan. After examining minutely the positions of the said between Tentris and the cataracts, the expedition was to occupy 8 months. Humboldt consented to join it on condition that he would be able to continue the journey over Palestine and Syria, and went to Paris to make the necessary preparations. He arrived at Paris in the spring of 1798, and was warmly welcomed by his brother William, whose house was a rallying point for all his educated countrymen. The family led a pleasant life during their stay in the capital, gave dinner parties, aesthetic teas, etc., and enjoyed themselves at the Parisian theaters. The comedy, wrote Frau von Humboldt, is excellent. My little ones would please you. Caroline grows very amiable. She is delicate and has a rare degree of sentimentality. Perfectly natural, however, as you may imagine. Her brother William is handsome, much more rough, very naughty, self-willed, and yet extremely good-natured. Theodore is the most amiable child I ever saw. He is stout and almost fat, and yet looks slender. His little face has an expression of merriment, and yet his glance seems to indicate something more profound. His eyes are as if you gaze into the heavens. The light in them is quite blue, and the eyeball brown. His hair is light, and his mouth the prettiest I ever saw in a child. If you could ever see the boy, he can make a fool out of you as he does me. The Humboldts were surrounded by celebrities of all sorts, artists, poets, statesmen, and savants. Among others who patronized them was the celebrated Madame de Stael, who called William, who had praised her works highly, it is scarcely necessary to say, la plus grande capacité d'Europe. Had the flattering Corinth Christianized Alexander so, she would not have been far from the truth. The political aspect of Europe destroyed the plan of the Egyptian's journey, as it had already done to the Italian one. And Lord Bristol, having been arrested at Milan, it was given up. Another scheme, however, was soon set afoot, for Humboldt now learned that the National Museum of France was preparing an expedition under the command of Captain Bowden. The purpose of this expedition was to visit the Spanish possessions of South America, from the mouth of the River Plata to the Kingdom of Quinto and the Isthmus of the Panama. It was to visit the archipelago of the Pacific, explore the coasts of New Holland, from Van Diemen's Land to that of Niutes, after which the vessels were to stop at Madagascar and return by the Cape of Good Hope. Humboldt had but little confidence in Bowden, who had given cause of discontent to the court of Vienna, which he had commissioned to conduct to Brazil the botanist Van der Schott. But as he could not hope with his own resources to make a voyage of such extent, he determined to make the chances of the expedition. He obtained permission to embark with his instruments in one of the vessels destined for the South Sea, reserving to himself the right to leave Captain Bowden whenever he thought proper. Maichalch and Bonpland were to accompany the expedition as naturalists. The war breaking out afresh in Italy and Germany, and the French government needing the funds for something more solid than science, it was postponed to an indefinite period. Truly, this was the pursuit of travel under difficulties. It is an ill wind, however, that blows nobody good. The failure of the expedition was no interpretation to the friendship which Humboldt had formed with Bonpland, the naturalist that in his 25th year was a native of Rochelle, France. His father was a physician and studied the same profession, but the revolutionary authorities got hold of him before he could finish his studies, and made him a surgeon on a man of war. When peace was restored to Paris, and became a pupil of the celebrated Cavissart, who had established a clinical school at the hospital of La Charte. It was at this time that Humboldt and he met. They were friends at once, understanding anatomy and botany better than Humboldt did. He gave them further instructions in those studies, receiving from him in an exchange of knowledge of natural history and mineralogy. Humboldt's friendship with Bonpland, the society that he met had the house of his brother William, and his own scientific attainments soon introduced him to the notice of the naturalists and mathematicians of France. He mingled with the most eminent French savants as their equal. He pursued his experiments before and after the failure of the expedition of Baudin, working in concert with Gay-Lussac, of whom hereafter with whom he undertook iodometric investigations of the chemical analysis of the atmosphere. The result of their labors was embodied in a joint production, Researches on the Composition of the Atmosphere. He also wrote a work on subterranean gases, the fruit of his experience in the mines of Bayreuth and Alsbach. In the autumn there was a prospect of another expedition. The Swedish consul, Skildebrand, was at Paris on his way to embark at Marseille on a special mission from his government with presents to the day of Algiers. He had resided a long time on the coast of Africa, and being highly respected by the government of Algiers, he could, he thought, easily procure permission for Humboldt to visit the chain of Atlas Mountains. A portion of these mountains had been visited by M. Desfontaines, but no mineralogist had yet been examined them. Besides this inducement, the consul dispatched every year a vessel for Tunis, where the pilgrims embarked for Mecca, and he promised Humboldt to convey him by this means to Egypt. The opportunity was too good to be lost. Humboldt completed his collection of instruments and purchased works relating to the countries he intended to visit. And bidding adieu to his brother and Frau Caroline, not forgetting the delicate Caroline Jr., the handsome but naughty William, and the amiable Theodore with his blue eyes and light hair, he repaired to Marseille with his friend Bonpland. They impatiently awaited the Swedish frigate, which was expected at the end of October. Several times a day they climbed the mountain of Notre Dame de la Garde, which commands an extensive outlook on the Mediterranean, eagerly watching every sail on the horizon. 2 months passed and no frigate came. Papers at length informed them that she had suffered severely in a storm at the coast of Portugal, and had been obliged to enter the port of Cadiz to refit. She would not be at Marseille till spring. Still persisting in their intention of visiting Africa, they found a small vessel of Ragusa on the point of setting sail for Tunis, and agreed with the captain for their passage. Before the vessel sailed, they learned that the government of Tunis, inimical to La Grande Nation, was persecuting its residents in Barbary, and that every person coming from a French port was thrown into a dungeon. The journey was abandoned. Not to be baffled, however, they resolved to pass the winter in Spain, in hopes of embarking into the next spring, either at Carthagena or Cadiz. They crossed Catalonia and the kingdom of Valencia, visiting the ruins of Tarragona and ancient Saguntum. They made an excursion to Barcelona and Montserrat, and saw the hermits that inhabit its lofty peaks. Humboldt ascertained by the astronomical observations the position of several points important for the geography of Spain, and determined by the barometer the heights of the central plain, the inclination of the needle, and the intensity of the magnetic forces that came in for a share of his attention. They arrived at Madrid in March 1799, and the Humboldt was presented to the King of Aranjuez by the minister from the court of Saxony. who was himself a mineralogist. The king received him graciously. He explained to the King's Majesty the motives which led him to undertake his journey to the New World, and presented a memoir on the subject to the Secretary of State. Don Mariano Luis de Arquillo, the minister, supported Humboldt's demand and obtained for the travelers 2 passports, one from the first Secretary of the State and another from the Council of the Indies. The good time had come at last. Never, says Humboldt, had so extensive a permission have been given to any traveler, and never any foreigner had been honored by more confidence on the part of the Spanish government. The Savans of Madrid offered the travelers great inducements to stay a while among them. Don Casimir Ortega, the Abbe Porret, and the learned authors of the Flora of Peru opened to them their rich collections. They examined parts of the recently discovered plants of Mexico, from drawings which had been sent to the Museum of Natural History of Madrid, and obtained from the chemist Proust and mineralogist Harrigan some curious details of the minerals substances of America. They could have spent a long time, usefully as well as pleasantly, in the Spanish capital, but bearing in mind their previous disappointments, they departed about the middle of May en route for Corunna, whence they intended to embark for Cuba. They crossed a part of Old Castile and the kingdoms of Leon and Galicia. The snow still covered the lofty granite tops of Guadarrama, but in the deep valleys of Galicia, the rocks were clothed with cistus and arborescent heaths. Pursuing his geological researches on the way, Humboldt examined the mountains between Astorga and Corunna, and found that many of them were composed of grey-wacke. Near Corunna, he came on granite ridges which contained tin ore. Arriving at Corunna, they sought Don Rafael Cavillo, the superintendent of the dockyards, to whom they had recommendations from the Spanish minister and the chief secretary of state. He advised them to embark on board the frigate Pizarro, which was soon to sail for Cuba, in company with Alcudia, the packet boat of the month of May, which had been detained by an English fleet and then blockading the port in order to cut off the communication between Spain and her colonies. They concluded to follow his advice, and arrangements were made to receive their instruments on board the Pizarro. Don Rafael ordered the captain to stop at Tenerife as long as the Humboldt should deem necessary, that the travelers might visit the port of Orotava and ascend the peak. It was 10 days before their instruments were embarked and the vessel was ready to sail. They spent that time in preparing the plants that they had collected in the beautiful valleys of Galicia, which they were the first naturalists to explore, and examining the fuci and mollusca, which the northwest winds had cast on the rocks. Crossing from Corunna to Ferrol, a little town on the other side of the bay, they made experiments on the temperature of the ocean by means of a valved thermometrical sounding lead, and found that the neighborhood of a sandbank is revealed before the lead can be made use of by the quick decrease in the temperature of the water, and that the seamen could therefore perceive the approach of danger much sooner by their thermometer than by the lead. At the time of departure, leading near von Humboldt wrote farewell letters to his friends in Germany and Paris. As before leaving Paris, he had agreed with Captain Bowden that if the expedition for discoveries in the Pacific, which was deemed to be adjourned for several years, should take place at an earlier period, he would endeavor to return from Algiers and join it at some port in France or Spain. He now wrote him that if the government persisted in sending him by Cape Horn, he would meet him at Montevideo, Chile, or Lima, or wherever else he should touch in the Spanish colonies. This was done. He was ready to bid the old world adieu. The English squadron was still off the harbor, but a storm coming up on the 5th of June, it was obliged to quit the coast and make for open sea. They seized the opportunity and set sail, cheered by a pleasing prophecy from those who saw the Pizarro weigh anchor, that he would certainly be captured in 3 days. They sailed at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The wind was contrary, and they made several tacks before they could get out of the harbor. At 6:30, they passed the lighthouse of Corunna, the famous Tower of Hercules. At sunset, the wind increased, the sea ran high, the shores of Europe lessened in the distance. The last thing they saw that night was the light of a fishing hut at Cisargra. It faded, the last disappeared, the land disappeared. The sea was before them, the wide waste sea.